You're changing. You just don't feel different yet. And that's why you think you're not growing. This video is about why growth doesn't feel like growth, and how to know you're actually progressing even when it doesn't feel like it. If you've been working on yourself but feel like nothing's changing, subscribe. We explore quiet transformation and invisible progress every Tuesday and Friday. Let me tell you about someone who thought he wasn't growing. He'd been working on himself for months, reading, journaling, trying to be more intentional, making small changes. But when he looked in the mirror, he felt the same. When he went to work, he still felt anxious in meetings. When he talked to his partner, he still got defensive. When he tried new things, he still felt that familiar resistance. And he thought, nothing's changing. I'm putting in all this work and I'm exactly the same person I was 6 months ago. So he started to give up. He stopped journaling, stopped trying so hard, stopped believing that change was actually possible for him. Because if you've been working on yourself and you don't feel different, it's easy to conclude that you're not actually growing. But here's what he didn't see. He was growing. He just couldn't feel it yet. Because growth doesn't feel like growth. Here's why. Growth happens in layers, not all at once. You don't wake up one day and suddenly you're a different person. You wake up one day and you're 1% different, and the next day another 1%, and the next day another. But 1% doesn't feel like anything. You can't feel 1% more patient. You can't feel 1% less reactive. You can't feel 1% more confident. 1% is invisible. But 1% compounded over 100 days, that's not invisible anymore. The problem is you're living inside the change, so you can't see it. If you see someone once a year, you notice how much they've changed. But if you see them every day, you don't notice anything because the change is too gradual. And you see yourself every day. So you don't notice the change, you just notice that you still feel like you, and you interpret that as, I'm not growing. But that's not true. You're just too close to see it. Here's what growth actually feels like. It doesn't feel like breakthrough. It feels like nothing. You don't suddenly feel confident one day. You just notice, weeks later, that you didn't avoid that conversation you would have avoided before. You don't suddenly feel patient. You just realize, looking back, that you didn't snap at your kid the way you used to. You don't suddenly feel disciplined. You just notice that you've been going to the gym 3 times a week for 2 months without thinking about it. Growth doesn't announce itself. It just quietly accumulates. And if you're waiting to feel different before you believe you're growing, you'll never believe it. Because feeling different isn't how growth works. Here's what happened to him. Someone he hadn't seen in 6 months ran into him in a coffee shop, and they said, "You seem different, calmer, more centered. What changed?" And he was confused because he didn't feel different. He didn't feel calmer. He still felt anxious and unsure and like he was figuring it out. But then he thought about it, and he realized 6 months ago he would have been spiraling about work right now, and he wasn't. He was just fine. 6 months ago, he would have spent the entire conversation trying to impress this person, and he didn't. He was just present. 6 months ago, he would have gone home and analyzed every word he said, and he probably wouldn't. He hadn't felt the change, but it had happened. All those small efforts, the journaling, the reading, the trying to be more intentional, they hadn't felt like they were doing anything, but they were. They were accumulating, quietly, invisibly, and the person he'd become didn't feel different from the inside because he'd become that person 1% at a time. But from the outside, it was obvious. Here's the test. If you want to know if you're growing, don't ask yourself, do I feel different? Ask yourself, am I doing things I couldn't do 6 months ago? Not big things, small things. Am I having conversations I would have avoided? Am I setting boundaries I wouldn't have set? Am I staying calm in situations that used to make me reactive? Am I showing up when I used to disappear? Because growth isn't about feeling different. Growth is about doing different. And if you're doing things you couldn't do before, even if it doesn't feel like a big deal, you're growing. You just can't feel it yet because you're living inside it. But if you could step outside and look at yourself the way someone who hasn't seen you in 6 months would, you'd see it. You'd see that you're not the same person you were. You're calmer, you're stronger, you're more intentional. You just don't feel it because growth doesn't feel like growth. It feels like nothing until you look back, and then you realize, I've come so far. So here's what you do. Track one metric, something small, something you're working on. How many times this week did you pause before reacting? How many conversations did you have that you would have avoided? How many times did you choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong thing? Don't track how you feel, track what you do. Because feelings lie. They tell you nothing's changing when everything is. But behavior doesn't lie. If you're doing things you couldn't do before, you're growing, even if it doesn't feel like it. And 6 months from now, when someone tells you you seem different, you'll know they're right, because you won't have felt the change, but it will have happened anyway. Here's what you need to understand. Growth doesn't feel like growth. It feels like nothing. You won't feel yourself changing. You'll just notice one day that you're not who you used to be. And all those small efforts you thought weren't doing anything, they were. They were building something, quietly, invisibly. You just couldn't see it because you were living inside it. If you've been feeling stuck even though you're working on yourself, I made a video about recognizing stagnation versus actual growth. It's connected. Link right here. See you there.